The mail coach lurched to a halt in the cobbled courtyard of Kilmorna Castle, just as the October rain began in earnest, those heavy Irish drops that seemed to carry the weight of centuries within them. Thomas Brennan, our protagonist, though he would have laughed at such a grand title, gathered his worn leather tool case and stepped down into the puddles already forming between the stones. At 37, he had the careful movements of a man who knew that every tool, every joint, every moment of clear-headed work meant bread on the table. The castle rose before him like something torn from the pages of those Gothic novels his late wife had loved. All gray stone and narrow windows that watched the world with suspicious eyes. Built in the 1600s, expanded in the 1700s, and now, in 1884, about to receive its first taste of electrical modernity. Progress, Brennan thought, with that wry humor that kept him sane, always arrives late to Ireland, and when it does, it must first negotiate with several centuries of ghosts. Mrs. O'Brien met him at the servants' entrance. The grand front door was not for the likes of traveling tradesmen, even skilled ones. She had that particular bearing of head housekeepers everywhere, spine straight as a bell-pull wire, keys jangling at her waist like metallic prayers, and eyes that could measure a man's character faster than he could state his business. "Mr. Brennan, I presume," she said, though it wasn't really a question. "You'll be wanting to see the bells first, I expect." The servants' hall struck him with its warmth after the damp cold outside, that particular mixture of coal smoke, cooking cabbage, and the ineffable scent of lives lived in close quarters. Along the far wall hung the bells, 42 of them in total, each connected by copper wire to rooms throughout the castle. They hung in neat rows like bronze fruit, each labeled with a room name in fading paint. Blue room, morning room, Lord's chamber, library. Some of the bells showed the polish of daily use. Others had gathered dust like mechanical memories. "Quite the orchestra you have here," Brennan observed, running his fingers along the wires with the unconscious intimacy of a man greeting old friends. The copper sang faintly under his touch, that metallic whisper that spoke of conductivity and potential. Several wires showed unusual wear patterns, rubbed thin in places where they shouldn't have seen much friction. His mind filed this away. In his trade, the smallest anomaly could herald the largest problem. Young Timothy appeared then, all of 15 years, and crackling with that desperate energy of youth trapped in service. The boy's eyes fixed on Brennan's tool case with the intensity of a starving man viewing bread. "Are you the electrical man, sir?" The words tumbled out before Mrs. O'Brien could properly introduce him. "The one who's going to bring the lightning indoors?" Brennan couldn't help but smile at that. The boy reminded him of himself at that age, though he'd been learning the trade at his father's knee rather than emptying chamber pots for the gentry. "Lightning's a bit dramatic, lad. It's more like domesticated thunder. All the power, none of the danger." This wasn't entirely true, of course. Electricity could kill a man faster than any storm, but the boy's enthusiasm deserved nurturing, not dampening. Mrs. O'Brien showed him to his quarters, a small room near the male servants' hall, functional and clean, with a narrow window that looked out onto the kitchen gardens. As she left, she paused at the doorway, seeming to weigh her words. "Mr. Brennan, there are things about this old place, peculiarities, you might say. The bells sometimes—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Well, you'll see for yourself soon enough." That evening, taking his supper with the servants, Brennan observed the careful hierarchies that governed life below stairs. Patrick Donnelly, the head footman, held court at the upper end of the table, his manner suggesting a man who saw his current position as merely a way station to greater things. He had that particular handsomeness that served well in a front-of-house position. Neat features, carefully maintained side whiskers, and hands that had never known truly hard labor. "You'll find Lord Ashworth most particular about the work," Donnelly informed him, with the air of one conveying privileged information. "His lordship has been poorly since her ladyship passed, and his nerves—" He let the sentence trail off meaningfully. The other servants shifted uncomfortably, and Brennan noticed how several of them glanced toward the bellboard, as if expecting sudden summons. Later, examining the bell system by lamplight while the household settled for sleep, Brennan traced the roots of copper through the walls, mapping the castle's nervous system in his mind. Some of these wires had been here for 60 years or more, installed when such systems were the height of luxury. Now, they would be replaced by electrical circuits, buttons instead of pulls, instant response instead of mechanical delay. Progress indeed, though looking at the craftsmanship of the old system, he wondered if something might be lost in the translation. Timothy appeared at his elbow, having crept down after lights out. "Mr. Brennan, sir, could you teach me? The electrical trade, I mean. I can read and figure, Mrs. O'Brien made sure of that, and I'm good with my hands." The boy's desperation was palpable, that crushing need to escape the predetermined path of service that stretched before him like a prison sentence. Brennan considered the boy, remembering his own daughter's last letter, full of subtle complaints about her seamstress apprenticeship, the long hours, the harsh mistress. Everyone, it seemed, was trying to escape something. "Tell you what, lad, you help me map these wires tomorrow, and I'll explain how electricity works. But you keep up with your regular duties, understood? I won't have Mrs. O'Brien after me for corrupting the hall boy." As he prepared for bed, Brennan studied the plans Lord Ashworth had provided, annotated in spidery handwriting with numerous additions and changes over the years. The castle was a palimpsest, each generation writing over the last, never quite erasing what came before. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate work of adding his own layer to this accumulation of centuries, bringing the harsh democracy of electrical light to corners that had known only candles and shadows. Outside, the rain continued its assault on the ancient stones, and somewhere in the depths of the castle, almost below the threshold of hearing, a bell rang once, though no hand had pulled its wire. 2 in the morning has its own particular quality in an old castle, a dense quiet that seems to press against the eardrums like water. Brennan woke not to sound, but to its absence, that sudden hollow feeling when something that shouldn't be there stops, leaving only the echo of wrongness. He lay still in the narrow bed, letting his senses adjust to the darkness, and then he heard it. A faint tinkling, metallic and mournful, coming from the direction of the servants' hall. The stone floor was ice beneath his bare feet as he pulled on trousers and shirt, moving with the practiced quiet of a man who'd learned not to wake his daughter during her colicky infant years. The corridor stretched before him, lit only by the dying embers visible through the kitchen doorway. As he approached the servants' hall, he saw he wasn't alone. 3 figures huddled near the bellboard, their faces pale ovals in the darkness. Bridget Kelly clutched a shawl around her shoulders, her 19 years making her look even younger in her fear. Beside her stood Mrs. O'Brien, hair in a long gray braid, holding a candle that trembled slightly. The third figure was one of the scullery maids, whose name Brennan hadn't yet learned, pressing herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into the stonework. The blue room bell was swaying ever so slightly, producing that thin, ghostly chime. But what made Brennan's craftsman's mind immediately alert was the impossibility of it. He had personally verified earlier that evening that the blue room's wire had been disconnected, coiled neatly and tied off in preparation for removal. Yet here was the bell, singing its lonely song to the darkness. "It's her," Bridget whispered, and in those two words carried the weight of absolute conviction. "My Aunt Mary. She was the one who answered the blue room before she—" The girl's voice cracked like thin ice. Mrs. O'Brien placed a steady hand on the girl's shoulder, though Brennan noticed the housekeeper's eyes never left the bell. "Hush now, child. The dead rest with God." But her Protestant certainty sounded forced, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Bridget. The bell gave one final definitive ring and fell silent. Patrick Donnelly appeared then, fully dressed despite the hour, his appearance as immaculate as if he'd been expecting to be summoned. "Just the wind through the old mechanisms," he announced with the authority of someone used to being believed. "These old castles, they settle at night. Creates drafts that can move the lightest objects." His explanation was perfectly rational, exactly what a modern man should say. Which made Brennan wonder why the footman was awake and dressed at such an hour. "Wind doesn't blow through disconnected wires," Brennan said mildly, approaching the bellboard with his candle. The copper wire that should have connected to the blue room bell was indeed severed and tied off, just as he'd left it. Yet examining the bell itself more closely, he noticed something odd. A faint residue on the metal, almost like the tarnish left by sweaty hands, but with a peculiar crystalline quality. Bridget had gathered herself enough to speak again, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. "5 years ago this Christmas it'll be. My Aunt Mary, she fell down the back stairs during that terrible storm. But before she fell, she were running from something. Or someone." The girl's eyes flicked meaningfully toward the upper floors where the family slept. "She'd been called to the blue room that night, late, just like this." "That's enough gossip for one night," Mrs. O'Brien said sharply, but Brennan caught the look she gave the bell, wary, watchful, the expression of someone who'd seen too much to dismiss anything entirely. After the women had returned to their quarters and Donnelly had stalked off with a final pronouncement about hysterical servants, Brennan remained alone in the servants' hall. He lit a proper lamp and began a thorough examination of the bell system. His fingers traced the paths of copper through their guides, testing tension, checking connections. The wire to the blue room was definitely severed, had been for at least a week, according to the oxidation patterns. So how had the bell rung? He climbed onto a stool to examine the bell itself more closely. There, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, was a second wire, hair-thin, running along the back of the mounting board, painted black to blend with the aged wood. This wire disappeared into a small hole drilled through the wall. Someone had created a secondary system, a ghost in the machine. The discovery should have brought satisfaction, the pleasure of a puzzle piece clicking into place. Instead, Brennan felt a crawling unease. This was deliberate deception, carefully planned and executed. But to what end? To frighten servants? To perpetuate a ghost story? Or something more calculating? He returned to his room to find a letter slipped under the door. It must have arrived with the evening post, but been forgotten in the bell drama. His daughter Margaret's careful script brought a different kind of ache. She wrote of her struggles with her apprenticeship, though she tried to hide them behind cheerful phrases. Her mistress was very particular about stitching, which Brennan read as harsh criticism. The other apprentices were not very welcoming yet, which meant loneliness. She asked after his health and work with the forced maturity of a child trying to be grown up too fast. Sitting on his bed, reading by candlelight, Brennan felt the weight of his choices. 3 years since Catherine's death, 3 years of trying to be both father and mother, provider and protector. The Bell installation work paid well, better than local jobs, but it took him away for weeks at a time. Margaret insisted she was fine, that her apprenticeship was a wonderful opportunity. But fathers develop their own supernatural senses about their children's unhappiness. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. Timothy stood in the doorway, barely visible in his nightshirt. "Sir, I saw the lights earlier. The bells, I mean. Bridget's crying in the kitchen. Says her aunt wants justice." Brennan motioned the boy inside. "What do you think, Timothy? Ghosts or gossip?" The boy considered this with surprising seriousness. "My gran always said the dead don't need bells to speak to us. They use our guilt instead." He paused, then added, "But I think someone alive is doing the ringing." The dead have better things to do than bother with servants' bells. There was wisdom in that young cynicism. Brennan showed the boy the secondary wire he'd discovered, explaining how someone could trigger the bell remotely. Timothy's eyes widened with understanding and something else, fear, perhaps, at the deliberateness of the deception. "But who would do such a thing?" the boy asked. "Someone who profits from fear," Brennan replied, though he didn't yet know what form that profit took. "Now off to bed with you. Tomorrow we start mapping the entire system, and I'll need those young eyes of yours to spot any more of these hidden wires." After the boy left, Brennan sat by his window, watching the Irish mist roll across the grounds. Somewhere in this castle, someone was orchestrating a haunting, using the very systems meant to serve the household. The ghost of Mary Kelly might not walk these halls, but something walked here. Human, calculating, and unafraid to use a dead girl's memory for its own ends. The bell in the servants' hall rang once more before dawn, a single, defiant note that spoke less of spirits than of someone testing their power, someone who knew that fear was a currency as valuable as any coin. Morning came wrapped in that particular Irish mist that turns the world into watercolor suggestions of itself. Brennan stood in the morning room with his notebook, sketching the locations of bell pulls, while Timothy held his measuring tape. The boy had proven surprisingly adept, his nimble fingers finding hidden wires behind wainscoting that Brennan's older eyes might have missed. They worked in companionable silence, the only sounds the scratch of pencil on paper and the occasional creak of the old house waking around them. Lord Ashworth made his appearance just after 10, leaning heavily on an ivory-topped cane that seemed more prop than support. At 62, he carried himself with that peculiar mixture of entitlement and anxiety that marked the Anglo-Irish gentry. Never quite English enough for England, never Irish enough for Ireland. His gout had swollen his left foot to the point where he wore a specially made velvet slipper, and his face bore the florid complexion of a man too fond of his port. "Brennan, good man," his lordship wheezed, lowering himself into a chair with obvious relief. "I trust the work progresses. I'm most anxious to have the electrical system operational before All Hallows Eve. Most anxious indeed." There was something beyond mere impatience in his tone, a nervousness that seemed at odds with the routine nature of the installation. Brennan chose his words carefully. "One didn't survive in service to the gentry, even tangential service like his, without learning to navigate their moods. The mapping is proceeding well, your lordship, though I've discovered some interesting modifications to the original bell system. Secondary wiring that's not on any of the plans you provided." Lord Ashworth's face went through a curious transformation. Surprise, then fear, then forced casualness. "Old houses, Brennan. Each generation adds their own touches, half of them probably forgotten before the ink dried on the receipts." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "Have you experienced anything unusual during your work?" Timothy, who'd been pretending to organize tools, looked up sharply. Brennan gave the boy a warning glance before responding. "Unusual in what sense, my lord?" "Oh, you know how servants gossip. Ghost stories and such nonsense. That poor girl who died, Mary something or other, they've built quite the mythology around her." His lordship's attempt at dismissiveness failed utterly. His hands trembled as he adjusted his cravat. Before Brennan could respond, Patrick Donnelly appeared in the doorway with the smooth timing of someone who'd been listening. "Your lordship's correspondence has arrived," he announced, though he carried no letters. "Shall I have it brought to the library?" Yes, very good, Donnelly." Lord Ashworth rose with apparent eagerness to escape. As he reached the door, he turned back to Brennan. "Whatever modifications you find, I want them removed, all of them. I want this new electrical system clean, modern, with no remnants of the past. You understand?" After his lordship's departure, Donnelly lingered, his eyes moving between Brennan and Timothy with calculating interest. "You'll want to be careful with his lordship's nerves," he said smoothly. "He's been most unsettled since her ladyship passed. Takes comfort in his faith now, pays for special masses every week. Father Murphy has become quite the regular visitor." The footman's tone suggested layers of meaning beneath the simple words. Brennan nodded noncommittally and returned to his sketching, but he felt Donnelly's gaze remain on him for several uncomfortable seconds before the man finally withdrew. They worked their way through the castle systematically. The dining room with its elaborate pulls hidden behind damask curtains, the library where 3 different bell systems had been installed over the decades, creating a copper spiderweb behind the bookcases. In each room, Timothy proved increasingly valuable, his young eyes catching details and his quick mind grasping the principles Brennan explained. "It's like the castle has veins," the boy observed, tracing a wire's path with one finger. "And the bells are its voice, calling out when it needs something." Brennan smiled at the poetry of it. "More like nerves, lad. The bell pulls are the fingers, the wires are the nerves, and the bells are the mouth that cries out. But soon it'll all be electrical, instant, efficient, no more delay between call and response." "Will it still work in storms?" Timothy asked. "My gran says electricity and lightning are cousins, that they call to each other." It was a more sophisticated question than Brennan expected. "That's why we install grounding wires, to give the lightning a path to Earth that doesn't go through the house systems. Though," he paused, remembering the crystalline residue on the blue room bell, "sometimes electrical charge can build up in unexpected ways." They'd reached the older wing of the castle by afternoon, where the walls were thicker and the sentries pressed closer. Here, behind a massive oak panel that Timothy discovered was actually a concealed door, they found the most elaborate network yet. Copper wires running in all directions, some connected to the main system, others disappearing into holes drilled through stone that must have taken tremendous effort. "Someone went to considerable trouble here," Brennan muttered, sketching quickly. Several wires showed signs of recent maintenance. Fresh oil on the guides, new cloth wrapping where they passed through rough stone. Yet according to Mrs. O'Brien, this wing had been largely unused for 2 years. A letter arrived as they worked, delivered by a nervous parlour-maid who wouldn't meet Brennan's eyes. Margaret wrote of a special commission her mistress had received, requiring all apprentices to work through Sunday. She tried to sound excited about the opportunity to learn advanced techniques, but Brennan read exhaustion in every line. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that her mistress had suggested she might benefit from additional years of training beyond the standard apprenticeship. The implications made Brennan's jaw clench. Extended apprenticeships were often merely excuses for cheap labor, keeping girls in bondage well into their 20s. He folded the letter carefully, his mind already calculating. Could he afford to break the apprenticeship contract? Could he find Margaret other opportunities? "Bad news, sir?" Timothy asked softly. "My daughter," Brennan replied without thinking, then caught himself. But the boy's sympathy was genuine, not prying. "It's hard, being away from family," Timothy said. "I haven't seen my own ma'am in 3 years, since I came into service. She's in Limerick, in the workhouse." The admission came out flat, matter-of-fact, the way the poor discussed their tragedies. They worked in heavier silence after that, mapping the hidden architecture of servitude, both mechanical and human. As the afternoon light faded, they reached the servants' quarters in the old wing, where the bells for the family rooms were mounted. Here, the secondary wiring was most elaborate, with multiple connections to each bell, and small mechanical devices Brennan couldn't immediately identify attached to some of the mechanisms. "Look at this," Timothy whispered, pointing to fresh scratches on the floorboards beneath the blue room bell. Someone had been here recently, probably last night, possibly while Brennan was examining the bell in the main servants' hall. Examining the area more closely, Brennan found what he'd begun to suspect: a small lever mechanism that could trigger the bell remotely, operated by a wire that ran along the floor molding and disappeared through a barely visible hole. The craft was impressive in its way, the work of someone who understood mechanical systems intimately. "Should we tell Mrs. O'Brien?" Timothy asked. Brennan considered. "Not yet. First, we need to understand why someone would build this. Fear is a tool, Timothy, but tools have purposes. What purpose does a ghost serve?" As they packed up their equipment for the day, Donnelly appeared again with his uncanny timing. "Making progress, I see. His lordship would be pleased. He's most anxious about All Hallows' Eve, you know. Most anxious indeed." The repetition of Lord Ashworth's exact phrase was surely deliberate. "Perhaps you'll have everything sorted by then. All the mysteries solved, all the ghosts laid to rest." The footman's smile was perfectly proper, but something in his eyes suggested he knew exactly what Brennan had found. More than that, he wanted Brennan to know that he knew. It was a dance of implications, each step careful, each gesture meaningful. That evening, as Brennan studied his sketches by lamplight, the pattern began to emerge. The secondary wiring wasn't random. It was designed to create specific effects at specific times, a theatrical apparatus hidden within the utilitarian bell system. Someone had turned Kilmorna Castle into an elaborate stage, and Mary Kelly's ghost was the starring role. But every theater needed an audience, and Lord Ashworth, with his guilt and his masses and his nervous anxiety, made for a perfect one. Thunder rolled across County Cork like the drums of an approaching army, and Brennan watched from the library windows as lightning turned the landscape into a series of stark photographs. There the garden, there the old oak, there the churchyard wall, each illuminated for a heartbeat before plunging back into darkness. He'd been installing the new electrical switches in the main hallway when the storm began, and now he stood transfixed, watching nature's own electrical display with professional appreciation. The bells began their cacophony just after 9 o'clock. Not one or two, but a dozen or more, ringing in discordant harmony as each lightning strike sent its charge through the atmosphere. Brennan rushed to the servants' hall to find chaos. Mrs. O'Brien trying to calm the younger maids, Bridget Kelly on her knees praying, and the bells dancing like possessed things on their springs. "It's the storm," Brennan announced firmly, raising his voice above the metallic din. "Lightning creates electrical charge in the air. The copper wires act as collectors, gathering that charge until it builds up enough to move the bell mechanisms." He demonstrated with his hands, trying to make the invisible visible for the frightened servants. Mrs. O'Brien seized on his rational explanation like a lifeline. "You heard Mr. Brennan. It's science, not spirits. Everyone back to your duties." But even as she restored order, her eyes kept returning to the bells with deep unease. What Brennan didn't say aloud was what puzzled him most. The bells that rang strongest weren't the ones with the longest wire runs, which would collect the most charge. Instead, it was specific bells, including the Blue Room bell, that seemed to respond most violently to each lightning strike. He made mental notes while appearing to calmly check connections, his mind working through the implications. Patrick Donnelly materialized. The man had an absolute genius for dramatic entrances, carrying an oil lamp that cast his face in theatrical shadows. "His lordship is most distressed by the noise," he announced. "He wishes to know if Mr. Brennan can quiet the disturbance." Following Donnelly through the castle's corridors during a thunderstorm was like walking through the inside of a drum. The ancient stones seemed to conduct sound, amplifying each thunderclap until Brennan could feel them in his chest. They found Lord Ashworth in his study, huddled in a wing chair with a glass of brandy that shook in his grip. "The bells, Brennan," his lordship gasped. "She's angry tonight. Mary. She always was afraid of storms, and now—" He trailed off, staring at nothing. "It's electrical interference, my lord," Brennan explained patiently. "The storm is creating charged fields that affect the copper wiring. Once the new electrical system is installed with proper grounding—" "Father Murphy says the dead speak through the elements," Lord Ashworth interrupted. "That God allows them to use natural phenomena to communicate their distress. He says Mary's soul is troubled because of how she died." Donnelly smoothly refilled his lordship's glass, his movements practiced and precise. "Father Murphy is very wise in such matters," the footman murmured. "His special masses have brought some comfort, haven't they, my lord?" Lightning flashed directly overhead, the thunder following instantly, and somewhere in the castle multiple bells rang in response. Lord Ashworth whimpered, actually whimpered, and Brennan felt a flash of contempt, quickly followed by pity. Here was a man imprisoned by his own guilt, whether deserved or manufactured. Returning to investigate the bell system more thoroughly, Brennan made a startling discovery. Someone had been maintaining certain wires specifically to maximize their electrical collection during storms. They'd been polished to remove oxidation, their insulation deliberately compromised at key points, and small copper additions had been soldered on. Amateur work, but effective, creating what amounted to primitive lightning rods that fed directly into the bell mechanisms. Timothy found him examining these modifications, the boy having crept from his quarters despite the late hour. "I saw Mr.
Donnelly go up to the old wing during the last storm," the boy whispered. "He had something in his hands, tools maybe. Did anyone else see this?" "No, sir. I was supposed to be asleep, but the thunder," Timothy shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. Together they traced the modified wires, finding more evidence of deliberate tampering. Someone had turned the castle's bell system into a storm-responsive instrument, designed to create maximum effect during weather like tonight's. The work was clever but flawed. Whoever had done it understood basic electrical principles but not the dangers. One wrong connection and they could set the entire system ablaze. A massive lightning strike, close enough that the flash and thunder were simultaneous, sent every bell in the servants' hall into violent motion. But Brennan noticed something else, a pattern in the chaos. The bells weren't ringing randomly, there was a sequence, almost like a code. Blue room, morning room, library, blue room again. The same pattern repeated with each major strike. "It's speaking," Bridget Kelly gasped from the doorway, clutching her shawl. "Mary's trying to tell us something." Brennan didn't dispute her interpretation, though he knew the pattern had a more earthly explanation. Someone had wired the bells to respond in sequence, creating the illusion of communication. But why? What message was being sent, and to whom? Mrs. O'Brien appeared with news that added another piece to the puzzle. "Father Murphy is here, Mr. Brennan. Came through the storm to pray with his lordship. Says he was called by the spiritual disturbance." Her tone was carefully neutral, but Brennan caught the skepticism beneath. "Does Father Murphy often arrive during storms?" Brennan asked. "These past 6 months, regular as clockwork whenever there's rough weather. Always seems to know when his lordship will be most generous with donations for special masses." The pattern was becoming clearer. Storms created electrical activity. Electrical activity triggered the modified bells. The bells frightened Lord Ashworth, and Father Murphy arrived to offer expensive spiritual comfort. Whether the priest was complicit or merely opportunistic remained to be seen. Another letter from Margaret had arrived with the evening post, delayed by the storm. Her mistress had fallen ill, she wrote, and the apprentices were managing the shop alone. One of the older girls had been put in charge and was proving harsh in her new authority. Margaret's careful words couldn't hide her exhaustion and unhappiness. She ended with a question that broke Brennan's heart. "Do you think Mama would be proud of how I'm managing?" Timothy, still helping with the investigation, noticed Brennan's distress. "Your daughter, sir?" "She's struggling with her apprenticeship." "Trying to be brave about it." "Maybe she could come here," Timothy suggested innocently. "Castle's always needing seamstresses. Mrs. O'Brien mentioned just yesterday that Lady Ashworth's niece will be visiting soon and will need a lady's maid." It was a thought worth pursuing, though Brennan wondered at the price. Bringing Margaret here would mean breaking her apprenticeship contract, which would require money he didn't have, unless he found ways to make himself more valuable to Lord Ashworth, unless he solved the mystery of the ghost that wasn't a ghost. The storm began to subside near midnight, the thunder growing distant, the lightning becoming mere flickers on the horizon. The bells quieted too, their bronze voices falling silent one by one. But Brennan had seen enough. Someone was orchestrating an elaborate deception using Lord Ashworth's guilt and the castle's own infrastructure. The storm had revealed the mechanism. Now he needed to uncover the motive.
As he prepared for bed, one last detail caught his attention. On his desk was a small copper coil, still warm to the touch, that hadn't been there before. Attached was a note in careful copper plate. Some ghosts are worth more alive than dead. Be careful which ones you lay to rest. The message was unsigned, but Brennan recognized the precision of the handwriting. Patrick Donnelly was either warning him or threatening him, perhaps both. The game, it seemed, had entered a new phase, with stakes higher than a simple electrical installation. The attic spaces of Kilmorna Castle existed in their own temporal dimension, where centuries of dust had settled into geological layers, and forgotten possessions mouldered in corners like archaeological specimens. Brennan climbed the narrow servants' stair before dawn, his lamp casting wild shadows among the rafters. The copper trail he'd been following for 2 days led here, to this liminal space between the lived-in castle and the sky. Timothy had wanted to accompany him, but Brennan had refused. If his suspicions were correct, this investigation could prove dangerous for a hall boy with no protection beyond his wits. Instead, he'd set the lad to creating a detailed inventory of all electrical supplies, a task that would keep him visible and accounted for throughout the morning. The attic stretched the entire length of the old wing, broken into sections by massive timber supports that had held the castle's roof for 3 centuries. Brennan moved carefully, testing each floorboard before trusting his weight to it. The modified wires he'd been tracking converged here, running along the beams like copper veins, all leading toward the farthest corner where the servants' quarters bordered the family wings. Fresh disturbances in the dust told their own story. Someone had been here recently and regularly. He could make out a worn path between the stair door and the corner. Along this path, he found evidence of activity, candle drippings still soft enough to take a fingerprint, fresh scratches on the floorboards where something heavy had been dragged, and most tellingly, copper shavings that gleamed bright against the ancient wood. Behind a massive oak beam, concealed by strategic placement of old traveling trunks, Brennan discovered what he'd been searching for. Someone had constructed a crude but effective electrical apparatus. Leyden jars for storing charge, copper coils for amplification, and an ingenious system of levers and wires that could trigger specific bells in sequence. It was amateur work, but showed real understanding of electrical principles, the kind gained from watching and learning rather than formal education. "Remarkable, isn't it?" Patrick Donnelly's voice came from behind him, causing Brennan to spin around, nearly dropping his lamp. The footman stood at the attic entrance, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Please don't look so alarmed, Mr. Brennan. I'm not here to push you down the stairs like poor Mary Kelly." The casual mention of murder made Brennan's blood chill, but he kept his voice steady. "So she was pushed?" "Oh, I couldn't say for certain. I was a mere under-footman then, barely worth noticing.
But I noticed things. I noticed how Lord Ashworth's younger brother, Mr. James, had been paying particular attention to Mary. I noticed how she rebuffed him. I noticed how angry that made him. Donnelly moved closer, his footsteps deliberate. And I noticed how, after Mary's unfortunate fall, Mr. James left for India rather suddenly, and Lord Ashworth began paying for masses for her soul. Guilt by association, Brennan said, understanding dawning. Guilt is such a useful emotion, Donnelly agreed. It makes men generous.
Lord Ashworth has been most generous these past months, paying Father Murphy for special masses, making donations to the church, all to quiet a ghost that sings through copper wires and electrical charge. Father Murphy, is he part of this? Donnelly laughed, a sound without humor. That old fool! He genuinely believes he's saving his lordship's soul. He has no idea that I'm the one who ensures the manifestations occur just when his lordship's faith and purse might be wavering. Brennan gestured at the apparatus. This could kill someone. Electrical charge is nothing to play with. Neither is poverty, Mr. Brennan. Do you know what a footman's wages are? Do you know what it's like to serve men who spend more on wine in a week than you see in a year? Donnelly's composure cracked slightly, showing the anger beneath. I've been in service since I was 12. I've watched. I've learned. I've perfected the art of being invisible while seeing everything. This, he gestured at the electrical equipment, is my masterpiece. And what stops me from exposing you? Several things. Donnelly pulled out a folded paper. This is a letter from your daughter. Intercepted, I'm afraid. She writes of running away from her apprenticeship, of coming to find you. Quite touching, really. But if she breaks her contract, you'll owe 3 years' premium, plus penalties, more than you'll make from this job. Brennan's hands clenched, but Donnelly continued smoothly. However, I might be able to help. Lord Ashworth's niece arrives next week. She'll need a companion, someone young and trainable. I have his lordship's ear in such matters. Your daughter could have a position here, properly paid, properly treated. All you have to do is complete your electrical installation without disturbing my little arrangement. The offer hung between them like a charged wire. Brennan thought of Margaret's unhappiness, of the grinding poverty that awaited them both if he refused, of the comfortable position she could have here. He thought, too, of Bridget Kelly's tears, of Lord Ashworth's genuine terror, of the way lies multiplied like rats in darkness. I need time to think, he said finally. Until tomorrow, Donnelly agreed. But remember, Mr. Brennan, I'm offering your daughter a future. What can your principles offer her? A father too proud to compromise, and a life of genteel starvation. After Donnelly left, Brennan remained in the attic, studying the apparatus with professional interest despite his moral revulsion. The man had created something genuinely clever, a system that harvested atmospheric electricity during storms and could trigger bells on demand during calm weather using stored charge. It was brilliant and horrible in equal measure. He found other things, too, a diary hidden beneath loose floorboards, written in Mary Kelly's hand. The entries from her final weeks painted a picture of escalating harassment from James Ashworth, of appeals to Lord Ashworth that went unheard,
of desperate plans to leave service that were thwarted at every turn. The final entry, dated the day she died, was simple. He says if I won't have him willingly, he'll take what he wants anyway. God help me. So Donnelly's ghost was built on truth. Lord Ashworth's guilt was real, even if the manifestations were not. The moral complexity of it made Brennan's head ache. Was it justice to torment a man with his legitimate guilt? Was it theft to take money from someone who owed a debt he'd never willingly pay? Returning to his room, he found another letter from Margaret, this one delivered properly. Her mistress had recovered, but had become even harsher, accusing the apprentices of laziness during her illness. One girl had been dismissed without reference for speaking back. Margaret was counting the days until she could see him again, though she didn't know when that might be. Timothy appeared at his door with tea and news. Mrs. O'Brien says Father Murphy will be holding a special service tomorrow night. All Souls' Eve, he calls it. Says the veil between worlds grows thin. The boy paused. Mr. Donnelly asked me to tell you he's arranged for your daughter to visit. She could arrive as early as next week, if you approve. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Donnelly had made him complicit simply by revealing the truth. To expose the scheme would be to destroy his daughter's chance at a better life. To remain silent would be to enable continued fraud. Either choice would haunt him. That night, unable to sleep, Brennan climbed back to the attic alone. He sat among the copper wires and electrical apparatus, thinking about conductivity, how electricity always sought the path of least resistance, how human nature often did the same. Somewhere below, Lord Ashworth probably lay awake too, tormented by guilt, both real and manufactured. Somewhere in Dublin, Margaret might be lying awake as well, dreaming of escape from her servitude. The bells remained silent, but Brennan could feel the potential in the wires around him, the stored energy waiting to be released. Tomorrow, he would have to choose his path. Tonight, surrounded by the physical manifestation of an elaborate lie built on a foundation of truth, he wondered if there was any choice that didn't make him a ghost himself, haunting his own conscience for years to come. The summons came at 11:30, delivered by a trembling parlor maid whose cap sat askew and whose eyes were wide with fear. Lord Ashworth required Brennan's immediate presence in the Blue Room, the very chamber that had become the center of the haunting. Brennan pulled on his jacket and followed the girl through corridors lit by flickering gas lamps that seemed to make the shadows dance with malevolent life. He found Lord Ashworth in a state of complete dissolution. The man sat in a wing chair facing the corner where Mary Kelly had once answered his brother's summons, his nightshirt soaked with perspiration, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles showed white through the skin. The bells had been ringing for 20 minutes, the girl whispered, always the same pattern. Blue room, morning room, library, and back again. She's spelling something, Lord Ashworth gasped when he saw Brennan. B-M-L. James's initials backward. Library, morning, blue. She's naming her murderer from beyond the grave. His eyes held the particular brightness of terror pushed to the edge of madness. Patrick Donnelly stood by the fireplace, his expression a masterpiece of concerned propriety. His lordship has been under considerable strain, he murmured to Brennan.
Perhaps if you could examine the bells, provide some scientific explanation. But Brennan was watching the footman's hands. There, the slightest movement of his right thumb pressing something in his pocket. The bells rang again, right on cue. The man was operating his apparatus remotely, probably through a wire running under the carpet. The audacity of it was breathtaking. "My lord," Brennan said carefully, "the pattern could have many explanations. The way electrical charge dissipates through copper, the varying lengths of the wires." "Don't patronize me!" Lord Ashworth's voice cracked. "I know what I know. James had appetites. I tried to protect the staff, but I was weak, too concerned with family reputation." He turned those terrified eyes on Brennan. "I'll pay you double, triple your fee, if you can make her stop. Install your electrical system tomorrow, tonight, now."
Tear out every wire in the castle if you must. Such work requires precision, my lord. Haste could cause fires, even explosions. Then what can you do? The question came out as a wail. Donnelly stepped forward smoothly. "Perhaps Father Murphy could perform another special mass, my lord. He's had some success in calming the manifestations before." Yes, send for him immediately." Lord Ashworth clutched at this straw desperately. "And Brennan, there must be something, some way to quiet the bells just for tonight." Brennan found himself at a crossroads. He could expose Donnelly now, reveal the apparatus in the attic, end the torment. But he thought of Margaret's letter in Donnelly's possession, of the promise of a position for her, of the grinding poverty that awaited them both if he played the hero. "I could install temporary grounding wires," he heard himself say. "They might absorb some of the electrical interference causing the bells to ring." "Do it," Lord Ashworth commanded. "Whatever it takes." For the next hour, Brennan went through an elaborate pantomime of installing copper grounding rods, knowing full well they would do nothing to stop Donnelly's mechanical triggers. The footman watched with barely concealed amusement, occasionally offering to help, each offer a small mockery of their shared deception. Father Murphy arrived just after midnight, his elderly frame bent against the wind, his face bearing the genuine concern of a shepherd for his flock. The priest was no fraud, Brennan realized with a pang. He truly believed he was battling supernatural forces for Lord Ashworth's soul. It made the deception somehow worse. "The forces of darkness grow bold," Father Murphy intoned, sprinkling holy water in the corners of the room. "But faith is stronger than fear, my lord. We must increase our efforts." Daily masses, perhaps, and a more substantial donation to establish a perpetual prayer for Mary Kelly's soul. Lord Ashworth agreed to everything, promising amounts that made even Donnelly's eyes widen. The fear had broken something in the man. He would pay any price for peace. Brennan watched it all with growing disgust, at Donnelly, at himself, at the whole rotten system that created such opportunities for exploitation. "Mr. Brennan's grounding wires seem to be working," Donnelly announced after a suitable interval of silence from the bells. "Perhaps science and faith together can overcome these troubles." The look he gave Brennan was triumphant, conspiratorial. "We're partners now," it said. "You've taken the first step. The rest will be easier." Back in his room, Brennan found Timothy waiting with urgent news. "I saw something, sir. When I was cleaning the grates this evening, there's a book in Mr. Donnelly's room about electricity and galvanism." "And there were copper wires in his drawer, the same kind you've been finding." "You shouldn't be searching his room, Timothy. It's dangerous." "But, sir, if he's the one—" "I know who it is," Brennan said quietly. "The question is what to do about it." Timothy's young face showed confusion, then understanding, then disappointment. "You're not going to stop him?" "It's not that simple, lad. There are other considerations." "There always are for grown folks," Timothy said with a bitterness that belied his years. "That's what my mam said when she put me in service. Other considerations meant she couldn't feed me anymore." After the boy left, Brennan sat at his small desk and tried to write to Margaret. How could he explain the compromise he was contemplating? How could he justify trading Lord Ashworth's torment for her comfort? The words wouldn't come. A soft knock interrupted his struggle. Mrs. O'Brien entered, her face grave. "I know what's happening, Mr. Brennan."
"I'm not blind or deaf, and I've been in service too long not to recognize the signs of manipulation." She sat uninvited, her dignity intact despite the late hour and informal circumstances. "Patrick Donnelly is a serpent, but he's our serpent. He looks after the staff in his way. The money his lordship pays from masses and donations, some of it finds its way to servants' families in need. Bridget Kelly's mother receives a monthly allowance from anonymous Christian charity. Timothy's mother in the workhouse gets parcels. Blood money, Brennan said. Food money, rent money, medicine money. Mrs. O'Brien's pragmatism was harder than steel. Lord Ashworth's family made their fortune from Irish suffering. Is it so wrong that some of that fortune returns to Irish hands, even through deception? It's still fraud, still cruelty. Yes, she agreed simply, but so is the system that makes it necessary. I don't ask you to approve, Mr. Brennan. I ask you to understand. And to consider that exposing Donnelly would hurt more than just him. The servants he helps would suffer. Your daughter would suffer. Sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of wrong. She left him with that thought, and Brennan spent the remaining hours until dawn wrestling with it. Outside his window, the first gray light revealed the castle grounds shrouded in mist, looking like something from the ghost story Donnelly had created. But the real ghosts here weren't supernatural. They were the living spirits crushed by poverty, by class, by the grinding machinery of a system that made men like Donnelly into both victims and victimizers. When the bells rang again just before sunrise, a single, mocking chime from the Blue Room, Brennan understood it was Donnelly's way of reminding him that time was running out. Tomorrow, he would have to give his answer. Tomorrow, he would have to choose which ghost to serve, the manufactured specter that fed the living, or the truth that might starve them all. The morning brought unexpected clarity to Brennan's mind, the kind that comes when a craftsman stops fighting a problem and starts working with it instead. In his makeshift workshop in the castle's old stable, he laid out copper wire, zinc plates, and glass jars, the components of a proper electrical demonstration. If he was going to navigate between truth and deception, he would need proof that couldn't be denied or manipulated. Timothy arrived with breakfast and immediately sensed the change in Brennan's demeanor. "You've thought of something, haven't you, sir?" "I've thought of many things, lad. Help me with these wires." "We're going to create our own ghost." They worked through the morning, constructing a simple but effective electrical generator, a Wimshurst machine that could produce visible sparks and enough charge to ring bells without any connection to storms or stored power. Brennan explained each step to Timothy, finding comfort in the honest transfer of knowledge even as he planned his careful deception. "Static electricity is everywhere," he explained, turning the machine's crank to produce a cascade of tiny blue sparks. "In the air, in our clothes, in the very stones of this castle."
What Donnelly discovered, accidentally I'd wager, is that the old copper wiring acts like a net, catching and storing this charge. During storms, the effect multiplies dramatically. But he's also pulling wires mechanical-like, Timothy observed. I've watched him. His right hand in his pocket when the bells ring. Clever boy, yes. He's combining natural phenomena with stage tricks.
The question is whether Lord Ashworth is paying for peace from a genuine haunting or manufactured one.
Bridget Kelly interrupted them, her face pale with fresh distress. "Mr. Brennan, sir, could you come? There's something you should see. In my aunt's old room." The servants' quarters in the attic were cramped and cold, each small room a testament to the minimal comfort afforded to those who kept the castle running. Mary Kelly's room had been left untouched since her death, a morbid shrine that none of the servants would claim. Bridget led into a loose floorboard she'd discovered while praying there that morning. Beneath it lay a small leather journal and a bundle of letters tied with ribbon. The journal was Mary's, but the letters were from James Ashworth, each one more insistent than the last, progressing from flowery courtship to angry demands to outright threats. The final letter, dated the day before Mary's death, was explicit. Submit or be dismissed without reference, condemned to starvation or worse. She had no choice, Bridget whispered. That's why she was going to the Blue Room that night. She'd given up fighting. But the journal's last entry told a different story. Mary had planned to confront Lord Ashworth directly, to show him his brother's letters, to demand justice or at least protection. She never got the chance. Someone had pushed her down the stairs before she could reach the family quarters. "This is evidence of motive," Brennan said carefully, "but not of murder. Everyone knows Mr. James left for India right quick after," Bridget said, "and his lordship started paying for masses almost immediately. Guilt money, my aunt's friends called it." Brennan pocketed the journal and letters. Here was ammunition, should he need it, proof that Lord Ashworth's guilt was justified, even if the haunting was not. He was building his own apparatus now, not of copper and electricity, but of truth and leverage. That afternoon, he requested a private audience with Lord Ashworth. He found the man in his study, haggard and hollow-eyed, clutching a glass of brandy, though it was barely past 2 o'clock. Donnelly stood nearby, ostensibly arranging flowers, but obviously monitoring the conversation. "My lord, I've made significant progress in understanding the electrical disturbances," Brennan began. He produced his Wimshurst machine and demonstrated how static charge could move small bells he'd attached to copper wires. "You see, the castle itself is generating these effects. The combination of atmospheric conditions, the copper wiring, and certain architectural features creates a natural battery of sorts." Lord Ashworth watched the sparks with fascination and fear. "But why the patterns? Why those specific rooms?" "The length and composition of the wires create different resistance levels. The Blue Room, Morning Room, and Library happen to have the optimal configuration for this phenomenon." It was nonsense, but it sounded scientific enough to be believed. "Then it's not Mary?" Brennan chose his words carefully, aware of Donnelly's sharp attention. "I believe Mary Kelly is at peace, my lord. What we're experiencing is an echo, like hearing your own voice bounce off a mountain. The castle remembers her, in a sense, through these electrical patterns." "An echo," Lord Ashworth repeated, seizing on this interpretation.
Not a haunting, but an echo. However, Brennan continued, there's something else you should know. He produced Mary's journal and letters, watching both Lord Ashworth and Donnelly react, his lordship with shock, Donnelly with calculation. These were hidden in her room. They suggest she was coming to see you the night she died, to seek your protection from unwanted advances. Lord Ashworth's face crumpled. James, oh God, I suspected.
But family, you understand. Family loyalty. He grabbed Brennan's arm. Did he? Was she? I believe she fell before reaching you, Brennan said gently. Whether by accident or design, we'll never know. But your guilt, my lord, your payments for masses, they've not been misplaced. You failed to protect her in life. Your attempts to help her in death are admirable.
Donnelly's expression had become unreadable, but Brennan saw his hand move to his pocket, where the trigger mechanism presumably rested. The bells remained silent.
I'll continue the masses, Lord Ashworth said firmly. And I'll establish that perpetual fund Father Murphy suggested. It's the least I can do. Very generous, my lord, Donnelly murmured. After leaving the study, Donnelly cornered Brennan in the hallway. That was cleverly done. You've given him peace without destroying the source of his charity. I underestimated you. I've given him truth, Brennan replied. The guilt is real. The debt is real. Whether the ghost is real matters less than the reality of his obligation. And my arrangement needs modification. The bells stop their midnight concerts. In exchange, I'll complete the electrical installation in a way that allows for future possibilities. Controlled demonstrations, perhaps, when his lordship's charitable impulses need reinforcement. But no more terror, Donnelly. Fear is a tool that breaks with overuse. Donnelly considered this. You're proposing a partnership. I'm proposing a transition. From fraud to managed truth. Your ghost has made Lord Ashworth confront his family's crimes. Let that be enough. Take your victory and be satisfied with it. And your daughter will come here as discussed. But she'll know nothing of this. She'll be companion to his lordship's niece, nothing more. That evening, Brennan demonstrated his electrical system to the assembled servants, showing how he could make bells ring at will using his generator. He explained, in terms they could understand, how natural forces had created their ghost, and how the new electrical system would prevent such disturbances. Mrs. O'Brien watched with knowing eyes, but said nothing. Bridget Kelly seemed relieved to have an explanation that didn't dishonor her aunt's memory. Timothy absorbed every detail, understanding that he was witnessing more than just electrical principles at work. Later, alone in his workshop, Brennan modified Donnelly's crude apparatus, improving its safety and efficiency while installing careful limitations. It could still trigger bells, but only under specific conditions that would require deliberate action. He was creating a controlled haunting, one that could remind Lord Ashworth of his obligations without driving him to madness. The work satisfied him in a way that pure honesty wouldn't have. He was using his craft to forge a compromise between justice and mercy, between truth and necessity. Mary Kelly was dead and couldn't be brought back, but perhaps her echo could ensure that others didn't suffer as she had. The private confrontation between Brennan and Donnelly came at dusk in the castle's old chapel, a place where neither servants nor family ventured regularly. Donnelly had chosen the location with his typical theatrical instinct. The dying light through stained glass windows cast everything in shades of blood and gold, while carved saints watched from their niches with blind stone eyes. "You've been busy, Mr. Brennan," Donnelly said, examining the improved apparatus Brennan had brought to show him. "Teaching young Timothy, comforting Bridget, even giving Mrs. O'Brien plausible explanations for her suspicions. Quite the diplomat for a simple tradesman." "We're all more than we appear," Brennan replied. "You've proven that admirably. A footman who understands electrical principles well enough to build a functioning capacitor system? That's no small achievement. Books, Mr. Brennan. Amazing what one can learn from books when the gentry retire early and leave candles burning." Donnelly's fingers traced the copper coils with something approaching affection. "I started reading to better myself, to understand the conversations I overheard. Then I discovered I had an aptitude for natural philosophy, especially electrical science." "You could have pursued legitimate work with such knowledge." Donnelly's laugh was bitter as winter wind. A Catholic Irishman from County Stock seeking work as an electrical engineer? They'd have laughed me out of Dublin. "No, Mr. Brennan, men like us, we take what opportunities present themselves, not the ones we dream about." The truth of that struck home. Brennan himself had only managed to learn his trade through his father's connections, Protestant connections that opened doors firmly closed to men like Donnelly. The system that created the opportunity for fraud also prevented legitimate advancement. A serpent eating its own tail. "Your modifications to my apparatus," Donnelly continued. "They're elegant. Safety mechanisms I hadn't considered. More efficient charge storage. And these limiting switches. Insurance against overuse, I presume?" "Insurance against murder," Brennan corrected. "Your original design could have started a fire, could have killed someone during a storm. These modifications make it a tool of persuasion, not a weapon." "And you think that absolves us? That technical improvements somehow clean the moral stain?" Before Brennan could answer, the chapel door opened. Mrs. O'Brien entered, followed unexpectedly by Father Murphy. The old priest looked between the two men and the electrical apparatus with growing comprehension. "So it's true then," Father Murphy said heavily. "Young Timothy came to confession. Couldn't carry the weight of what he'd seen."
I didn't want to believe it, his gaze fixed on Donnelly. "You've made me party to fraud, Patrick. Used my genuine faith to fleece a troubled man. I've redirected ill-gotten wealth to those who need it," Donnelly shot back. "How many of your parishioners have benefited from Lord Ashworth's sudden charity? How many children fed? How many roofs repaired? How many doctors paid? Through deception, through justice," Donnelly insisted. "The Ashworths built their fortune on Irish backs, Father. Their wealth comes from rents that starve families, from a system that grinds us down generation after generation. I've simply found a way to return some of it." Mrs. O'Brien spoke for the first time. "What's done is done, Father. The question now is what happens next." She turned to Brennan. "Mr. Donnelly tells me you've reached an accommodation." "Of sorts," Brennan admitted. He explained his proposal, the managed haunting, the controlled reminders of obligation without the cruelty of terror. "Lord Ashworth's guilt is genuine. His brother was a predator,
Mary Kelly died seeking justice, and his lordship failed in his duty to protect his servants. The ghost may be manufactured, but the debt is real. Father Murphy struggled visibly with the moral complexity. And if I expose this, then Lord Ashworth stops his donations, Donnelly said bluntly. The church roof continues leaking, the school closes, the soup kitchen shutters. Your choice, Father, righteous poverty or compromised charity? You're asking me to be complicit in a lie. I'm asking you to be complicit in survival, Mrs. O'Brien said quietly. We all make compromises, Father. Even the church takes money from men whose wealth comes from suffering. The priest aged years in moments, his shoulders sagging under the weight of impossible choices. I won't lie from the pulpit, but neither will I destroy what good has come from this deception. That's all we ask, Brennan said. After Father Murphy left, shaking his head and muttering prayers, Donnelly produced a letter from his pocket, Margaret's latest correspondence to her father. A gesture of good faith, he said, handing it over. Your daughter arrives tomorrow on the afternoon coach. I've arranged everything with his lordship. She'll be companion to his niece with a generous salary and prospects for advancement. Brennan read quickly. Margaret was free of her apprenticeship, the mistress having agreed to release her after a mysterious benefactor paid the cancellation fee. She was nervous, but excited about the new position, grateful beyond words for this opportunity. Her joy was palpable in every line. The benefactor. That was you? Insurance, Donnelly said simply. Happy daughters make for cooperative fathers. The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Brennan understood the new shape of his cage, gilded perhaps, but still a cage. He was now as much a part of the mechanism as the copper wires and electrical circuits. There's one more thing, Brennan said, producing Mary Kelly's journal and letters. These need to disappear. They're evidence that could destroy everything we've built here. Your scheme, my daughter's position, the whole delicate balance. Donnelly took them, understanding immediately. Into the fire tonight. Though it seems a shame, poor Mary deserves to have her story known. She deserves justice, Mrs. O'Brien said firmly. But since that's impossible, she'll have to settle for her memory being used to help others. It's not enough, but it's something. They dispersed as darkness fell completely, each returning to their roles in the castle's elaborate performance. Brennan went to his workshop to prepare the final components of the electrical system, the work that would complete his official task here. But he knew his real work was just beginning, maintaining the balance between truth and deception, between justice and mercy. Timothy found him there, working by lamplight. Is it finished then, sir? The whole business with the ghost? Nothing's ever truly finished, lad. It just changes form. He showed Timothy the new electrical switches he was installing, explaining how they would work. Like energy itself, never created or destroyed, just transformed from one state to another. Will Miss Margaret like it here, do you think? Brennan considered his answer carefully. I hope so, Timothy. I hope she finds what she's looking for. And what about you, sir? What are you looking for? The question hung in the air like static charge before a storm. What was he looking for? Not truth. He'd abandoned pure truth when he'd agreed to Donnelly's compromise. Not justice. Justice had died with Mary Kelly on those stairs 5 years ago.
Perhaps he was looking for something more modest but more achievable. A way to live with the choices forced upon him by circumstance. "I'm looking for the path of least resistance," he finally answered. "The way forward that does the least harm to the most people." "Sounds like something an electrician would say," Timothy observed, with a wisdom beyond his years. As midnight approached and the castle settled into sleep, Brennan made one final check of the bell system. Everything was quiet, the bells hanging silent in their rows like bronze fruit waiting to ripen. Tomorrow his daughter would arrive, and he would have to pretend that her good fortune was simply luck rather than the price of his complicity. He touched one of the bells gently, feeling the cold metal against his palm. Somewhere in this castle, Mary Kelly had died seeking justice. Now her ghost, or the lie of her ghost, would live on, a manufactured spirit serving real purposes. It wasn't right, but perhaps it was as right as this wrong world would allow. The séance was Donnelly's idea, but Brennan transformed it into something far more sophisticated than the footman had envisioned. Lord Ashworth's niece, Lady Catherine, had arrived from London that morning with fashionable ideas about spiritualism and table rapping, providing the perfect excuse for what would become the final act of their elaborate performance. Brennan spent the morning installing the last of the electrical switches in the main reception rooms, but his real work was the hidden secondary system, a network of thin wires and small electrical actuators that could create precise effects on command. Timothy assisted, his quick fingers and sharper mind proving invaluable as they threaded nearly invisible copper filaments through existing decoration.
"It's like building a puppet theater," Timothy observed, "except the puppets are sounds and lights." "And the puppet master will be the truth," Brennan replied, though he wondered if he still recognized truth when he saw it. Margaret had settled into her role as Lady Catherine's companion with surprising ease. Watching her at luncheon, dressed in a proper gray dress that had appeared mysteriously in her room, laughing at her mistress's stories, Brennan felt both pride and unease. She was happy, genuinely, radiantly happy, but her happiness was built on a foundation of lies he'd helped construct. Lady Catherine proved to be everything her uncle was not: young, vibrant, skeptical of tradition, and fascinated by modern innovations. "Uncle Reginald tells me you've been experiencing supernatural phenomena," she said to Brennan, with barely concealed excitement. "I absolutely insist on a proper séance tonight. I've attended dozens in London, you know."
Most are fraudulent, but occasionally she let the possibility hang tantalizingly. "I'm merely an electrical engineer, milady," Brennan demurred, but Donnelly smoothly intervened. "Perhaps Mr. Brennan could ensure that electrical interference doesn't disturb the proceedings. His expertise might help us achieve a clearer connection." The meaningful look Donnelly gave him spoke volumes. This was to be their masterstroke, the performance that would cement Lord Ashworth's charitable obligations while freeing him from terror. A controlled revelation that would satisfy everyone, except perhaps the ghost of Mary Kelly, who remained truly dead despite all their theatrical resurrection attempts. That afternoon, Father Murphy arrived for what he announced would be a special blessing of the household before All Souls' Day. The old priest looked haggard, caught between his conscience and practical necessity. He pulled Brennan aside while the family gathered in the drawing room.
"I've prayed on this matter," he said quietly. "I cannot condone deception, but neither can I abandon those who depend on Lord Ashworth's charity. So I've decided, tonight, during this séance nonsense, I'll speak certain truths that need speaking. Not about your
arrangements, but about obligation, about duty to those who serve us, about the debts the living owe the dead. It was, Brennan realized, the priest's own compromise, using the false seance to deliver genuine moral instruction. Everyone, it seemed, was finding ways to balance truth and necessity. The seance began at 9 o'clock in the Blue Room, the very chamber where Mary Kelly had been summoned 5 years ago. Lord Ashworth sat rigid with tension, Lady Catherine bubbled with anticipation, and Margaret watched everything with the wide eyes of a girl seeing how the wealthy amused themselves. Mrs.
O'Brien and Donnelly stood ready to serve. While Timothy had been stationed in the electrical control room, Brennan had established in an adjacent closet.
"We must all join hands," Lady Catherine instructed, clearly in her element. "The circuit must be complete for the spirits to manifest." Brennan had placed copper strips under the tablecloth, connected to his electrical apparatus. When the circle of hands closed, a tiny current would flow. Not enough to harm, just enough to create a slight tingling that spiritualists claimed indicated supernatural presence. "Are there any spirits present?" Lady Catherine intoned dramatically. The bells began to ring, not chaotically as before, but in a clear, deliberate pattern. Blue room, morning room, library. Then a pause, then morning room, library, blue room. The reversal was so obvious that even Lord Ashworth noticed. "She's trying to tell us something different," he whispered. Brennan activated the next phase. Using his hidden wires and electrical actuators, he made the gaslights dim and brighten in sequence, creating the illusion of a presence moving around the room. Margaret gasped and gripped Lady Catherine's hand tighter, not acting, but genuinely startled by effects she hadn't expected. Then came Brennan's masterpiece. Using a hidden speaker cone connected to a vibrating membrane, a principle he'd read about in scientific journals, he created a low, thrumming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Not words, but something almost like breathing, like the castle itself was alive. "Mary Kelly," Lord Ashworth said, his voice breaking, "if you're here, give us a sign. Tell us what you want." Father Murphy stood suddenly, his face pale but determined. "She wants justice," he said, his voice carrying the authority of genuine conviction. "She wants the living to remember their obligations to the dead.
She wants those who failed to protect her to protect others."
The priest wasn't playing along. He was seizing the moment to speak truth through the medium of deception. "The dead don't need our money or our masses as much as they need us to learn from our failures, to ensure that no other young woman suffers as Mary Kelly suffered, to create a world where service doesn't mean servitude, where poverty doesn't mean powerlessness." Lord Ashworth was weeping now, and even Lady Catherine had lost her theatrical composure. Brennan triggered the final effect, a gradual brightening of all the lights simultaneously, suggesting a presence departing, moving toward peace. "She's leaving," Lady Catherine breathed. "She's finally at rest." "No," Lord Ashworth said firmly, surprising everyone. "She's not at rest. She won't be until we make things right. Father Murphy is correct. Money for masses isn't enough. We need real change." He turned to Mrs. O'Brien.
"From now on, any servant in this household who feels threatened or mistreated comes directly to me. No intermediaries, no delays. And we'll establish a fund, not for prayers, but for education, to help servants' children escape service if they choose." Donnelly's expression was unreadable,
but Brennan caught the slightest nod of approval. This was better than extorted charity. This was genuine reformation, prompted by manufactured guilt. The séance ended with everyone shaken but somehow cleansed. As the participants dispersed, Donnelly approached Brennan. "That wasn't what we planned." "No," Brennan agreed. "It was better. Your ghost has done its work, Donnelly. Lord Ashworth will continue his charity, not from fear, but from genuine commitment." "Isn't that what you wanted?" "What I wanted was justice for people like us," Donnelly replied. "But perhaps this is as close as we'll get in this life." Later, as Brennan dismantled his special effects apparatus with Timothy's help, Margaret found them. "Father, that was extraordinary. How did you—" She stopped, understanding dawning. "You created those effects, didn't you? It wasn't real?" Brennan looked at his daughter, so happy in her new position, so bright with possibility. "The effects weren't real," he said carefully. "But the feelings they provoked, the changes they inspired, those are real. Sometimes, Margaret, we use illusion to reveal truth." She considered this with the seriousness he loved in her. "Like using a story to teach a lesson?" "Exactly like that." As the castle settled for the night, Brennan made one last check of the bell system. The new electrical switches were all functioning perfectly, modern and efficient. But he'd left some of the old copper wiring in place, hidden but accessible. Not for fraud, but as a reminder. Sometimes the old ways of doing things, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, shouldn't be entirely discarded in the rush toward progress. Timothy helped him pack his specialized tools. Tomorrow, the boy would officially begin his apprenticeship, Lord Ashworth having agreed to sponsor his training. It was one good thing to come from all this deception: a young man's escape from the trap of service through the application of genuine skill. 2 weeks had passed since the séance, and Kilmorna Castle had settled into a new rhythm. Like a clock that had been running fast, finally adjusted to keep proper time. Brennan stood in the servants' hall on All Souls' Day morning, watching the new electrical bell indicators with their small red flags that dropped silently when a room called for service. Progress had arrived, clean and efficient, though he noticed the old bronze bells still hung in their rows above, retained at Mrs. O'Brien's insistence as decorative elements. The November rain that seemed perpetual in County Cork drummed against the windows. But the castle felt different now, lighter somehow, as if the very stones had exhaled a breath they'd been holding for 5 years. Margaret had adapted to her new life with an ease that both pleased and slightly worried him. She moved through the castle's routines as if born to them, though he knew she'd learned to navigate by watching others, always watching, the way the poor learn to survive among the wealthy. "The copper's been loaded for transport," Timothy announced, entering with ledgers to record the final inventory. The boy had taken to his apprenticeship with fierce dedication, already mastering principles that had taken Brennan years to understand. "Mr. Donnelly says to tell you the scrap dealer offered a good price, enough to cover my first year's training materials and then some." Donnelly had become almost legitimate in these 2 weeks, his energies redirected toward managing Lord Ashworth's new charitable foundation with the same cunning he'd once applied to manufactured hauntings. The footman had discovered that genuine good works, properly publicized, brought their own rewards, social standing, influence,
And yes, opportunities for personal advancement that didn't require midnight bell ringing. "Your father wants you," Timothy told him, then caught himself with a grin. "Sorry, sir, I mean Miss Margaret sends word that you're wanted in the morning room." Brennan found his daughter there with Lady Catherine. The two of them bent over correspondence. Margaret was reading aloud from applications to the new Servants' Education Fund, her voice clear and confident, in a way it had never been during her seamstress apprenticeship. Lady Catherine was teaching her more than just social graces. She was teaching her how to wield the soft power available to women in their position. "Father, listen to this one," Margaret said, her eyes bright. "A kitchen maid from County Mayo wants to learn nursing. She's been teaching herself to read using medical texts borrowed from the local doctor. Isn't that remarkable?" "Remarkably familiar," Lady Catherine observed with a knowing smile. "Rather like a certain footman teaching himself electrical principles from borrowed books, wouldn't you say, Mr. Brennan?" The lady knew then. Perhaps she'd always known. The wealthy weren't all fools, despite what the servants believed. Some, like Lady Catherine, simply chose which deceptions to acknowledge and which to ignore. Lord Ashworth entered, moving easier now that his gout had improved. Anxiety, Dr. Harrison suggested, had been exacerbating his condition. "Brennan, excellent. I wanted to speak with you before you departed." He settled into a chair with only minimal wincing. "I've been thinking about what Father Murphy said during that evening, about obligations to the dead. My lord, I've decided to write to my brother James in India. It's time he faced what he did, even if only between us. And I've instructed my solicitor to establish a permanent fund in Mary Kelly's name, not for masses, but for the protection of servants who find themselves in vulnerable positions." It was more than Brennan had hoped for, this genuine reformation born from artificial haunting. He wondered what Mary Kelly would think, knowing her death had finally produced the protection she'd sought in life. Mrs. O'Brien appeared to announce that Father Murphy had arrived for the All Souls' Day service. The entire household would attend, from Lord Ashworth down to the newest scullery maid. It was tradition, but this year felt different. Less about appeasing the dead, and more about remembering them honestly. In the chapel, as Father Murphy spoke about the communion of souls, living and dead, Brennan's mind wandered to the strange journey that had brought them all here. A simple bell installation had become a moral maze, forcing him to confront questions he'd spent his life avoiding. Could good come from deception? Could lies serve truth? Could a manufactured ghost honor a real woman's memory? After the service, Donnelly pulled him aside. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package. Inside was a photograph, new, expensive, the kind only the wealthy usually afforded. It showed Margaret in her new gray dress, seated beside Lady Catherine, looking every inch the proper companion. "For your travels," Donnelly said. "A reminder of what we've accomplished here." "What you've accomplished, you mean?" "This was all your design." "No," Donnelly said seriously. "I was just pulling wires in the dark, hoping for coins. You transformed it into something else. A machine for justice, however imperfect. You showed me that craft could serve higher purposes than mere profit." They shook hands, these two men who'd begun as adversaries and ended as something like allies, bound together by shared compromise and mutual benefit. As Brennan supervised the loading of his tools onto the coach that would take him to his next installation, a manor house in Waterford,
Timothy appeared with a final question.
Sir, do you think Mary Kelly knows?
About all this, I mean. About how we used her story. Brennan considered the boy who would soon be his official apprentice, who would learn not just electrical principles, but the harder lessons of navigating a world built on inequality.
I think, he said carefully, that the dead care less about how we remember them than that we remember them at all, and that we learn from their lives and deaths. The coach pulled away from Kilmorna Castle as the afternoon light began to fade, All Souls' Day drawing to its close. Through the coach window, Brennan could see the castle's windows beginning to glow, not with candlelight, but with the steady gleam of electrical bulbs, modern and efficient. Yet he knew that in the attic, some of the old copper wiring remained, carefully maintained, just in case the castle needed to remember its ghosts. Margaret would write to him weekly, he knew, letters full of her new life and its possibilities. Timothy would learn his trade and perhaps surpass his teacher. Donnelly would rise through cunning and charity combined. Lord Ashworth would sleep peacefully, his conscience salved by good works. Father Murphy would continue his ministry, preaching truth even when surrounded by comfortable deceptions. And Mary Kelly? Mary Kelly would remain dead, but her death had finally produced its own strange fruit. Not justice exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that would have to suffice in a world where the perfect remained the enemy of the possible. As the castle disappeared behind Irish mist and approaching darkness, Brennan allowed himself a moment of philosophical contemplation. They'd all been pulling wires in this elaborate performance, some copper, some moral, some emotional. Every person connected to every other through invisible lines of obligation and need, desire and fear, creating patterns as complex as any electrical circuit. The bell system of human relations, he thought with a tired smile, where every pull produced a response somewhere else, often in unexpected places. He opened his notebook to sketch designs for the Waterford installation, but found himself drawing bells instead. 42 of them in neat rows, each one labeled with the rooms of Kilmorna Castle, each one holding its own secret history of calls answered and unanswered, of service demanded and given, of the endless dance between those who rang and those who responded. The coach rolled on through the Irish countryside, carrying him toward the next job, the next castle, the next set of problems to be solved with copper wire and careful thought. Behind him, Kilmorna Castle settled into evening, its new electrical system humming with quiet efficiency. While in the servants' hall, the old bronze bells hung silent but ready, waiting for the next ghost that might need their voice.